Violence explodes without warning. Silence falls over crowded shopping centers when authority crosses lines into brutality. An arrogant police officer, blinded by power, raises his hand against a seemingly frail elderly woman. Skin meets skin, creating a sharp crack echoing past storefronts. Shoppers gasp, anticipating a tragic fall. Instead, gravity shifts. Retribution arrives not through courtrooms, but through swift, undeniable physical dominance. She moves with terrifying precision, dropping her attacker to cold mall tiles instantly. Karma demands payment, delivering brutal justice right then and there. This incident destroyed a career, exposed deep corruption, and made history forever. The shopping pavilion was suffocatingly busy on a Saturday afternoon. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished marble floors, mixing with the heavy sweet scent of roasted almonds and expensive perfumes drifting from the department stores. Among the sea of frantic shoppers navigating the crowded corridors was Eleanor Whitaker. At her age, Eleanor moved with a quiet, measured grace that commanded a subtle respect. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, a silk scarf neatly knotted at her neck, and carried a simple, elegant leather handbag. Her silver hair was pinned back immaculately, framing a face lined with decades of lived experience. Yet her dark eyes retained a sharp, unyielding vitality. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor had just finished purchasing a fountain pen from a specialty stationery boutique, a retirement gift for a former colleague. She carried the small branded shopping bag in her left hand, humming a soft, rhythmic tune under her breath as she headed toward the mall's eastern exit. Watching her from the second-floor mezzanine was Officer Bryce Langford. Bryce was a patrolman for the city department who supplemented his income by picking up off-duty security shifts at the pavilion. He was a man deeply obsessed with his own reflection and the shiny brass badge pinned to his chest. Stocky, with a high and tight haircut and a perpetually clenched jaw, Bryce treated his mall security detail as though he were patrolling a high-stakes war zone. He had a documented history within his precinct of excessive force complaints and escalation warnings, all of which had been buried by a lenient union representative. Bryce thrived on intimidation. He possessed a deeply fragile ego, masked by a loud, booming voice and a heavy-handed approach to even the most minor infractions. Bryce had been tracking Eleanor for some time. In his mind, he had already constructed a narrative. He saw an elderly black woman walking alone, pausing occasionally to adjust her bag. To his heavily biased and cynical perception, her calm demeanor was suspicious. He decided, without a shred of evidence, that she had slipped something into her leather handbag at the jewelry kiosk downstairs. Adjusting his utility belt to ensure his handcuffs and baton were prominently displayed, Bryce descended the escalator, his boots thudding heavily against the metal steps. He cut through the crowd, deliberately shoving past a group of teenagers, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Excuse me. You there. Stop right there," Bryce barked, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the mall. Eleanor, assuming the loud voice was directed at someone else, continued her steady pace. She was barely yards from the glass exit doors when a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down on her right shoulder, pulling her backward. Eleanor stumbled slightly but instantly regained her footing, planting her feet with surprising stability. She turned around to find Bryce looming over her, his face flushed red with exertion and unwarranted anger. "Are you deaf? I said stop," Bryce demanded, stepping uncomfortably close, violating her personal space. Eleanor looked at the hand that had just grabbed her, then slowly brought her eyes up to meet Bryce's. Her expression was completely devoid of fear. "Officer, kindly remove your hand from my coat," she said, her voice smooth, articulate, and completely steady. Bryce's eyes narrowed. He was used to panic, stuttering, or immediate subservience. Eleanor's calm defiance felt like a direct assault on his authority. He dropped his hand, but pointed a thick finger at her chest. "I need to see inside that bag right now." "On what grounds?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head slightly. "I have made a single purchase at the stationery shop for which I have a receipt. I'm now leaving to go home." "I got reports of shoplifting," Bryce lied, puffing out his chest. "You fit the description. Open the bag, or I am taking you to the security office in handcuffs." A small crowd began to form. Shoppers slowed their pace, their attention caught by the booming voice of the police officer and the striking contrast of the dignified elderly woman he was confronting. If you suspect me of a crime, officer, you will need probable cause to search my personal belongings, Eleanor replied, her tone remaining conversational, though a dangerous cold edge was beginning to bleed into her words. A vague, fabricated description does not constitute probable cause. Bryce's face turned a deeper shade of crimson. The fact that she was educating him on the law in front of an audience made his blood boil. His fragile pride cracked. "Listen to me, you arrogant old—" He stepped forward, trying to snatch the leather handbag directly from her shoulder. Eleanor shifted her weight, pulling the bag out of his reach with a fluid, effortless motion. "Do not touch my property," she warned. The public denial was too much for Bryce. Logic vanished, entirely replaced by a blind, toxic rage. He did not see an elderly woman anymore. He only saw a target that needed to be broken. Without a second thought, Bryce pulled back his right hand and swung. He slapped her. It was a vicious, open-handed strike aimed directly at her face. The sound of flesh hitting flesh cracked like a gunshot through the atrium. The mall fell into an absolute, horrified silence. The murmurs died. The footsteps stopped. Every eye locked onto the scene. A woman near the pretzel stand let out a loud, piercing gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Bryce stood there for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving, a cruel smirk starting to form on his lips, fully expecting the elderly woman to crumple to the polished floor in tears and submission. He was incredibly, devastatingly wrong. Eleanor did not fall. Her head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow, a red welt instantly blooming across her left cheekbone. But her body remained perfectly rooted to the marble floor. For 2 agonizing seconds, the world seemed to freeze. The crowd held its collective breath. Bryce's smirk solidified, thinking he had won, thinking he had successfully established his dominance. Then Eleanor turned her head back to face him. Her dark eyes, previously calm, now burned with a terrifying, focused intensity. She did not shout. She did not cry. Instead, she exhaled a sharp, controlled breath. Before Bryce could process the lack of tears, before he could even lower his striking hand, Eleanor moved. She did not move like an elderly woman. She moved with the blinding, explosive speed of a coiled spring releasing its tension. Eleanor Whitaker was not just a retired civilian. She was a former master sergeant in the military police and a lifelong practitioner of Krav Maga and Judo. She had spent years neutralizing threats twice her size. Bryce's right hand was still lingering in the air between them. Eleanor's left hand shot up like a viper, her fingers locking around Bryce's thick wrist with a grip like industrial steel. Bryce's eyes widened in sudden confusion, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up his forearm as she squeezed exactly over the pressure points of his radial nerve. "Hey!" Bryce managed to choke out, trying to yank his arm back. It was too late. Using his own backward momentum against him, Eleanor stepped deep into his personal space, dropping her center of gravity. She pivoted sharply on her right foot, dragging his captured arm across her body. With her right hand, she delivered a lightning-fast open palm strike straight to the crook of his elbow, hyperextending the joint with a sickening pop. Bryce let out a high-pitched scream of agony. His knees buckled, but Eleanor was not finished. Maintaining her iron grip on his wrist, she drove her right leg behind his left calf in a flawless textbook sweep. Deprived of his balance and blinded by the sudden intense pain in his arm, Bryce went airborne. His frame was completely at the mercy of the elderly woman. He slammed face first into the unforgiving marble tiles with a deafening thud. His nose shattered on impact, spraying a brilliant arc of blood across the white floor. The breath was violently knocked from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a beached fish. Before he could even attempt to recover, Eleanor smoothly transitioned her weight. She dropped her knee squarely onto the back of his neck, pinning him to the floor while simultaneously twisting his hyperextended arm up behind his shoulder blades in a brutal submission hold. The entire sequence, from the moment Bryce slapped her to the moment his face smashed into the floor, took less than seconds. The crowd erupted. It was total bedlam. Shouts of shock, awe, and terror echoed off the glass ceilings. Instantly, a dozen smartphones were thrust into the air, their camera lights flashing, capturing every agonizing second of the police officer pinned beneath the impeccably dressed senior citizen. "Get off me!" Bryce shrieked, his voice muffled by the floor and thick with blood. He thrashed wildly, but Eleanor shifted her weight just a fraction of an inch, applying more pressure to his shoulder joint. "Do not move," Eleanor ordered. Her voice was no longer conversational. It was a commanding, authoritarian bark that cut straight through the chaos of the crowd. "If you struggle, I will dislocate this shoulder. Do you understand me?" Bryce whimpered, the fight completely drained from him, replaced by a humiliating cocktail of extreme pain and absolute disbelief. Okay, my arm. You were breaking my arm." Standing a few feet away, a college student named Kai Owens had his phone recording in stunning resolution. He had started filming the moment Bryce had grabbed Eleanor's coat. Kai's hands were shaking, but he kept the frame perfectly steady. "Holy," Kai muttered under his breath. "She just dropped a cop. Somebody call an ambulance for this man." Eleanor announced calmly to the surrounding crowd, not taking her eyes off the back of Bryce's head. "And call the real police. Tell them an off-duty security guard assaulted a civilian and has been detained." "You assaulted a police officer," Bryce spat, bubbles of blood forming on his lips as he pressed his cheek against the cold tile. "You are going to prison for the rest of your life. You crazy—" Eleanor leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for him. "You let your uniform make you brave, boy. But you forgot that a badge does not teach you how to fight. Now, breathe through your nose and stay completely still." In the distance, the shrill wail of approaching sirens began to echo toward the mall. The spectacle had reached a fever pitch. Shoppers were cheering, some were crying, and everyone was recording. The invincible, arrogant mall cop had been thoroughly and decisively dismantled, but the physical takedown was merely the prologue. The true destruction of Bryce Langford was only just beginning. Within moments, the eastern entrance of the pavilion was flooded with blue and red strobe lights. 4 uniformed officers burst through the glass doors, hands resting nervously on their holstered weapons. Leading the charge was Sergeant Marcus Ford, a veteran of the force. He scanned the massive crowd, expecting to see a dangerous suspect holding hostages. Instead, the crowd parted willingly, pointing toward the center of the atrium. Sergeant Ford stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping beneath his thick mustache. There, in a puddle of his own blood, lay Officer Bryce Langford, whimpering and pinned to the ground by an elderly woman in a beige trench coat. "Police, nobody move!" Ford shouted by pure instinct, though he was entirely unsure of how to process the scene in front of him. Eleanor looked up at the arriving officers. She did not raise her hands in panic, nor did she attempt to flee. She maintained her hold on Bryce, ensuring he could not reach for his utility belt. "Sergeant," Eleanor called out, her voice projecting with absolute authority, "this man assaulted me unprovoked. I have subdued him. I will release his arm when you have secured his weapons. He is armed with a standard-issue Glock on his right hip." Ford blinked, startled by her precise tactical language. He signaled for 2 of his officers to approach. "Ma'am, slowly release him and step back," Ford ordered, walking forward cautiously. Eleanor smoothly removed her knee from Bryce's neck, released his wrist, and stood up in one fluid motion. She adjusted her silk scarf, picked up her leather handbag from where it had fallen, and stepped back, her posture perfectly straight. Bryce immediately rolled onto his side, cradling his throbbing arm, his face a mess of blood and snot. "Arrest her!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "Assault on an officer! Attempted murder! She tried to kill me!" The 2 patrolmen hauled Bryce to his feet, groaning under his weight. Immediately tending to Bryce's shattered nose and checking his shoulder, Sergeant Ford approached Eleanor, holding up a notepad. "Ma'am, I need your name and a statement. Officer Langford is claiming you attacked him." Eleanor dabbed her cheek with a tissue she retrieved from her pocket, wincing slightly as it touched the red welt Bryce had caused. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker, and I highly suggest you interview the witnesses standing around you before you take the word of a man who assaults senior citizens." Kai Owens stepped out of the crowd holding his phone high. "Officer, I have the whole thing on video. He grabbed her, yelled at her, and then slapped her across the face. She just defended herself." A chorus of voices erupted from the crowd, validating Kai's claim. Shoppers pressed forward, offering their names and numbers to the bewildered police officers. Meanwhile, Bryce was being loaded onto a stretcher. His ego, shattered into pieces on the mall floor, rapidly mutated into a venomous desire for revenge. As the ambulance doors closed, Bryce pulled his union rep's phone number from his memory. He knew the system. He knew how to twist a narrative. By the time he reached the emergency room, Bryce was already drafting his official incident report in his head. He would claim Eleanor aggressively reached into her bag for what he believed was a weapon. He would claim she possessed superhuman strength, likely under the influence of narcotics. He would state that his strike was a preemptive defensive maneuver, and her retaliation was a calculated attempt on his life. He was confident his badge would shield him, just as it always had. Back at the precinct, Sergeant Ford escorted Eleanor into an interview room. He offered her a cup of water, treating her with a strange mix of suspicion and deep respect. "Mrs. Whitaker, I have to ask, how did you do that? Langford is a big guy." Eleanor took a sip of water, her eyes calmly tracking Ford. "Leverage and momentum, Sergeant. Size is a disadvantage if you do not know how to control your center of gravity." Ford sat down across from her, pulling up a background check on his computer terminal. He typed in Eleanor Whitaker. He expected to see a blank record, maybe a few parking tickets. Instead, a heavily restricted file flashed onto his screen, marked with an old Department of Defense seal and several state police credentials. Ford's eyes went wide. He scrolled through the file, his face paling with every line he read. Eleanor Whitaker was not just a retired military veteran. She was the former chief defensive tactics instructor for the state's regional police academy. She had spent years teaching cadets how to safely subdue suspects. In fact, looking closely at the dates, Ford realized something that made his stomach drop. She had literally written the hand-to-hand combat manual that every officer in their precinct, including Bryce Langford, was legally mandated to study. "Oh my God," Ford whispered, looking up from the screen to the elderly woman sitting quietly across from him. At that exact moment, Kai Owens pressed upload on his smartphone. He posted the high-resolution video to social media with a simple caption, "Arrogant cop slaps old lady at the mall, gets completely destroyed." The digital spark was lit. It would not just be a localized scandal. It was about to become a global inferno, and Bryce Langford, sitting in his hospital bed, typing out his fabricated, lying report, had absolutely no idea that he had just committed career suicide on camera. Fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly above the sterile emergency room at the hospital. The sharp chemical smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol did nothing to soothe the pounding headache radiating from the base of Officer Bryce Langford's skull. He lay on the stiff, crinkling paper of the examination table, his right arm bound tightly in a heavy blue sling. His shoulder had been violently relocated by an exhausted emergency room physician, a process that had left Bryce screaming obscenities until his throat was raw. His nose, fractured in 3 distinct places from his catastrophic impact with the mall floor, was packed with bloody gauze and tape securely across his cheekbones. Bryce stared at the drop ceiling tiles, his chest rising and falling in shallow, angry breaths. He was not processing the fact that he had assaulted a senior citizen. He was only processing the humiliation of his defeat. In his twisted, ego-driven worldview, he was the ultimate victim of a freak occurrence. The heavy wooden door to his room swung open, admitting Richard Donnelly. Donnelly was the senior representative for the Regional Police Benevolent Association, a man whose entire career was built on shielding aggressive cops from the consequences of their own actions. Donnelly was thick around the middle, wearing a cheap, rumpled gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne. He carried a leather briefcase and an expression of perpetual, cynical annoyance. "Look at you, Bryce," Donnelly grunted, pulling a plastic guest chair closer to the examination table. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. "You look like you went rounds with a concrete mixer. Tell me exactly what happened before Internal Affairs gets their claws into this." Bryce sat up slightly, wincing as a spike of pain shot through his rotator cuff. "It was a routine stop, Dick. Shoplifting suspect. Matched the description. I approached her, gave lawful commands to halt. She refused. I closed the distance, and she got instantly hostile." Donnelly pulled a yellow legal pad and a silver pen from his briefcase. He did not look at Bryce. He just started writing. "Hostile how? Verbally? Physically?" "Both," Bryce lied smoothly, the fabricated narrative already crystallizing in his mind. "She refused to show me her receipt. She started making erratic movements, reached into her coat. I thought she was going for a weapon, a knife, maybe a firearm. I utilized a standard open-handed distraction strike to create distance and neutralize the lethal threat. Next thing I know, she's on me. She had to be on something. PCP, meth, Something. Donnelly stopped writing and tapped the silver pen against his chin. He had heard variations of this exact lie 1,000 times. The reaching for a weapon defense, combined with the superhuman strength trope, was the union's bulletproof shield against excessive force lawsuits. It did not matter if it was true. It only mattered if it was documented in the official system first. Perfect, Donnelly muttered, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips. We file the official incident report tonight. Captain Donnelly is already drafting the press release. We are going with officer injured while subduing armed and erratic suspect. We will request a blood talk screen on the woman. By the time the local news gets it, she will be painted as a violent criminal, and you will be the hero who took a beating to keep the mall safe. She needs to be charged, Bryce spat, a drop of blood seeping into the gauze under his nose. Felony assault on an officer, resisting arrest. I want her put away for a decade. Oh, she will be, Donnelly assured him, standing up and snapping his briefcase shut. I'll have the paperwork filed with the precinct commander within the hour. You just rest up, Bryce. We control the narrative. We always control the narrative. What neither Bryce Langford nor Richard Donnelly realized was that the era of controlling the narrative through sheer institutional authority had ended years ago. They were operating under an obsolete playbook, completely blind to the digital tsunami that had already made landfall. Miles away, in a beautifully appointed, quiet suburban home, Eleanor Whitaker was sitting in her mahogany-paneled study. A cup of chamomile tea steamed gently on her desk next to a Tiffany lamp. She had applied a cold compress to her left cheekbone, where a dark, ugly purple bruise was beginning to bloom. Her posture, even in the privacy of her own home, was impeccably straight. Her laptop was open, displaying an incoming video call. Eleanor clicked accept. The screen split, revealing the serious, intensely focused face of a man sitting in a high-rise office. It was S. Lee Merritt, a highly prominent national civil rights attorney known for utterly dismantling corrupt police departments in federal court. Eleanor had not called a local public defender. She had called the heavy artillery. Mrs. Whitaker, Attorney Merritt said, his voice deep and vibrating with professional urgency, I have just reviewed the footage sent over by the young man at the mall. I also have my paralegals pulling Officer Langford's complete disciplinary history. It is extensive. The man is a walking liability. I suspected as much, Mr. Merritt, Eleanor replied calmly, taking a slow sip of her tea. A man does not strike an elderly woman in a crowded public space unless he has been taught, through years of institutional protection, that he is completely untouchable. They are going to lie, Eleanor, Merritt warned, leaning closer to his webcam. The precinct released a preliminary statement. They are claiming you were erratic, that you reached for a weapon, and that Langford acted in self-defense. Eleanor offered a cold, razor-thin smile. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster watching her opponent willingly walk into a forced mate. Let them file the charges. Let them put their lies into the official federal database. It is one thing to be fired for brutality, Mr. Merritt. It is quite another to be indicted for felony perjury, falsifying government records, and wire fraud. Merritt smiled back, understanding the brilliant, devastating trap she was laying. You want them to dig their own grave before we show up with the shovel? Precisely, Eleanor nodded. I will see you tomorrow morning at the precinct headquarters. Bring the federal filings. While Eleanor and her attorney finalized their legal guillotine, the internet was performing an execution of its own. Kai Owens, the college student who had recorded the entire interaction in stunning resolution, had not just posted the video to social media. He had sent it directly to several massive independent journalism outlets. By the following morning, the video had fundamentally broken the internet. The contrast was too stark, too viscerally enraging to ignore. Viewers watched the calm, dignified, impeccably dressed elderly woman calmly explaining her constitutional rights. They watched the aggressive, vein-popping arrogance of Officer Langford. And then, the comment sections erupted into an inferno of universal outrage. But the outrage quickly morphed into absolute, screaming astonishment as the second half of the video played out. The way Eleanor moved, the blinding speed, the perfect biomechanical leverage, the sheer, undeniable dominance as she folded a heavily armed man twice her size onto the floor, became instantly legendary. The internet dubbed her the Iron Matriarch. Digital forensic experts on social media platforms began ripping the video apart frame by frame. They zoomed in on Eleanor's hands, proving definitively that her hands were empty and completely visible at her sides when Bryce struck her. The reaching for a weapon narrative was entirely mathematically annihilated before the sun even came up. Back at the hospital, Bryce was finally drifting into a painkiller-induced sleep when his personal cell phone began to vibrate violently on the bedside table. Then the hospital room phone rang. Then a nurse rushed into the room, her face pale, holding a tablet. "Officer Langford," the nurse stammered, backing away from his bed as if he were radioactive. "The hospital administrator just called down. We have news vans pulling into the emergency room bay. There are thousands of people calling the switchboard." Bryce blinked heavily, the narcotics making his brain sluggish. "What? Why? What are you talking about?" The nurse did not speak. She simply turned the tablet around so Bryce could see the screen. It was a national morning news broadcast. The anchor was speaking with a grave, furious expression. Beside the anchor, playing on an infinite agonizing loop, was the ultra-high-definition video of Bryce slapping an old woman, followed immediately by him getting slammed face first into the marble tiles. Bryce's stomach dropped out from under him. A cold, suffocating wave of sheer panic rushed through his veins, entirely neutralizing the painkillers. The official police report, the lie he and Donnelly had so carefully crafted and signed hours ago, was now public record. He was officially on the hook for a fabricated narrative that millions of people could clearly see was a violent, malicious lie. His phone vibrated again. It was Richard Donnelly. Bryce managed to pick it up with his good hand, pressing it to his ear. "Dick," Bryce breathed, his voice trembling violently. "Dick, the video." "I know, Bryce. I know." Donnelly's voice sounded hollow, stripped of all its previous cynical confidence. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer questions from the nurses. I'm coming to get you right now. We need to get in front of this before the federal prosecutors see it." It was a pathetic, futile hope. The federal prosecutors had already seen it. The world had seen it. The karma had been dispatched, and it was currently accelerating toward Bryce Langford at terminal velocity. Morning broke over the city with a heavy, oppressive humidity, matching the suffocating tension inside the central headquarters of the Metropolitan Police Department. Captain Donnelly, a man who had spent his career expertly navigating bureaucratic scandals, was currently sweating completely through his pressed white uniform shirt. The precinct's media briefing room was packed far beyond its maximum fire code capacity. It was not just local news crews, national syndicates, civil rights advocates, and independent journalists had swarmed the room, their camera lenses locked onto the wooden podium like the barrels of a firing squad. The outrage outside the building was deafening, with hundreds of protesters having gathered before dawn chanting Eleanor's name. At the appointed hour, Captain Donnelly stepped up to the microphone flanked by a visibly sweating Richard Donnelly. Donnelly adjusted his collar, trying to project an air of institutional calm that he absolutely did not feel. They had convened this press conference to attempt a desperately late damage control maneuver, hoping to backpedal on the official report without admitting outright criminality. "Good morning," Donnelly began, his voice echoing loudly through the tense room. "We are here to address the incident that occurred yesterday afternoon at the pavilion involving Officer Bryce Langford. The department takes all allegations of excessive force incredibly seriously. We have reviewed the online footage, and we are opening a full, transparent internal investigation." A reporter from the front row immediately shouted over him, "Captain Donnelly, the official police report released last night stated the victim was erratic, hostile, and reaching for a weapon. The video clearly shows her hands at her sides. Did your officer commit perjury?" Donnelly leaned toward the microphone, his face tight. "We are asking the public not to rush to judgment based on a short out-of-context internet video. Officer Langford had a split-second decision to make. He slapped an elderly woman in the face unprovoked," another journalist interrupted aggressively. "Why is he not in handcuffs right now?" "As I stated," Donnelly said, his voice rising in panic, "the investigation is ongoing. We must follow due process." "The suspect? I am not a suspect, Captain Donnelly. I'm your worst nightmare." The voice cut through the shouting of the press corps like a polished steel blade. It was not loud, but the sheer commanding authority woven into the tone silenced the room instantly. Every camera pivoted toward the heavy double doors at the back of the briefing room. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Whitaker. She was no longer wearing the casual beige trench coat. Today, she wore a sharp charcoal gray tailored business suit. The dark purple bruise on her cheek was visible, an undeniable badge of the brutality she had endured. Flanking her on her right was attorney S. Lee Merritt, carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. Flanking her on her left were two stern-looking men wearing dark suits and earpieces, federal agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The reporters parted like the Red Sea, allowing Eleanor and her legal team to walk straight down the center aisle. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rapid, frantic clicking of camera shutters. Captain Donnelly looked like he had just seen a ghost. Richard Donnelly took a physical step backward, his eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Eleanor stopped directly in front of the podium, looking up at the two men. Her dark eyes were completely void of sympathy. "Captain Donnelly, Mr. Donnelly, you asked the public to wait for the full investigation. I have saved you the trouble." Attorney Merritt stepped forward, opening his portfolio and dropping a stack of heavily sealed documents onto the edge of the podium. At the time of the incident, Officer Langford, under the direct advisement of Union Representative Richard Donnelly, filed an official use of force report. In that report, he claimed my client was armed, dangerous, and chemically altered. Captain Donnelly, you signed that report, formally transmitting it to the state database. "This is highly irregular," Donnelly stammered, gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "You cannot interrupt a police press briefing." "I can do whatever I please within this department, Donnelly," Eleanor stated, her voice echoing perfectly into the podium microphones. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a solid brass badge enclosed in a thick leather wallet and slammed it down onto the podium next to Merritt's legal filings. It was not a police badge. It was an investigator's shield bearing the grand seal of the state governor's office. "For the benefit of the press," Eleanor announced, turning slightly to face the cameras, "my name is Eleanor Whitaker. I am not just a retired master sergeant and former chief defensive tactics instructor. As of recently, I was quietly appointed by the governor as the chairperson of the Independent State Police Oversight Commission. My mandate was to covertly investigate precincts with statistical anomalies regarding excessive force complaints against minorities." The briefing room exploded. Reporters were literally climbing over chairs to get a better angle. Flashbulbs strobed like a nightclub. Captain Donnelly's knees practically gave out, the color completely drained from his face. He was not just looking at a victim. He was looking at the woman who held the absolute unilateral authority to dismantle his entire precinct, freeze their federal funding, and revoke their pensions. "I visited the pavilion yesterday because we received complaints this year regarding an off-duty officer terrorizing shoppers," Eleanor continued, her voice slicing through the noise. "I did not expect to become the primary evidence, but Officer Langford graciously obliged." She turned her terrifying gaze back to Richard Donnelly. "You thought you were protecting the department, Mr. Donnelly. Instead, by conspiring to file a demonstrably false police report across a digital state database, you have committed felony wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of their civil rights under federal statute." Merritt picked up the narrative smoothly, pointing to the federal agent standing at the back of the room. "Federal warrants have already been executed. Officer Langford is currently being taken into federal custody directly from his hospital bed. He will not be returning to this force nor any force ever again." Donnelly opened his mouth to speak, to offer some slimy legal defense, but no words came out. He looked at the federal agents moving slowly down the aisle toward him, carrying zip-tie handcuffs. His career of burying the truth was over, annihilated in hours by a woman he had assumed was weak. "You relied on an obsolete system of intimidation, Captain," Eleanor said softly, though the microphones picked up every word. "You relied on the assumption that a badge grants immunity from physics, from the law, and from accountability. You forgot that power without discipline is just a liability waiting for a spark." Eleanor retrieved her badge, snapping the leather wallet shut and slipping it back into her pocket. She looked at the cameras one last time, ensuring the bruised side of her face was clearly visible to the millions watching live. "The era of arrogant men terrorizing our communities with absolute impunity is over," Eleanor declared. "If they wish to behave like criminals, we will happily accommodate them with a prison cell." With that, Eleanor Whitaker turned on her heel and walked back up the aisle, moving with the same devastating, unyielding grace she had displayed at the mall. Behind her, the federal agents stepped up to the podium and instructed Captain Donnelly and Richard Donnelly to place their hands behind their backs. The hard karma had not just hit Bryce Langford, it had completely eradicated the corrupt foundation that had enabled him. In the span of a single afternoon, an arrogant bully had tried to assert his dominance over someone he deemed beneath him. Instead, he shattered his own arm, destroyed his own freedom, and inadvertently activated the exact person possessing the power to tear his entire corrupt world down to the studs. True justice, as Eleanor proved, does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit and strikes with the speed of lightning. The concrete walls of the federal holding facility offered no comfort to Bryce Langford. The air inside his small, heavily sterilized cell was freezing, smelling faintly of industrial pine cleaner and despair. He sat on the edge of a thin, rigid mattress, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that felt like sandpaper against his skin. His right arm, still throbbing with a dull, ceaseless ache, was secured in a standard-issue medical sling. The heavy steel door across from him offered no handle on the inside, a glaring reminder that his days of holding the keys, of dictating the freedom of others, were permanently extinguished. Bryce stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his mind trapped in a terrifying, inescapable loop. Just days ago, he had been the undisputed king of his small fabricated empire at the pavilion. He had worn a badge that to him acted as an impenetrable shield against consequence. Now he was inmate number. His court-appointed federal defender had visited him earlier that morning. Richard Donnelly, the union representative who was supposed to be his savior, had been placed in a separate cell block, completely cut off from communication. The union had immediately severed all ties with both of them to save its own political skin. The lawyer's assessment of Bryce's situation had been brutally brief and devastatingly bleak. "The Department of Justice is making an example out of you, Bryce," the weary public defender had explained, sliding a thick stack of printed indictments across the metal visitation table. "You are not just facing local assault charges. S. Lee Merritt bypassed the county prosecutor entirely. You are being charged under Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Furthermore, because you and Donnelly coordinated to file a fabricated police report across state databases to cover it up, they have tacked on felony wire fraud and federal conspiracy." "But it was a split-second decision," Bryce had pleaded, his voice cracking, the arrogant bravado entirely stripped away. "I thought she had a weapon." The lawyer had simply pointed to a tablet playing the high-resolution video of the incident, which had now amassed millions of views worldwide. "Bryce, the whole planet can see her hands were empty. The jury will see her hands were empty. The federal judge, who happens to be a Reagan appointee with zero tolerance for police corruption, can see her hands were empty. If we go to trial, you will lose. And when you lose, the prosecution will ask for years." Back in his cell, the reality of those numbers finally crushed the last remaining fragments of Bryce's ego. Years. He would lose his pension. He would lose his house. He would spend the best years of his life locked in a cage, entirely surrounded by the very demographics he had spent his career harassing and intimidating. The karmic retribution was so absolute, so flawlessly engineered, that it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like an act of divine punishment. Outside the thick concrete walls of the detention center, the Metropolitan Police Department was undergoing a tectonic structural collapse. Eleanor Whitaker had not been bluffing when she declared herself the architect of their ruin. As the chairperson of the Independent State Police Oversight Commission, Eleanor moved with the surgical precision of a seasoned military tactician. She immediately froze the precinct's discretionary funding. Within days of Bryce's arrest, Eleanor and her commission issued subpoenas for every single use of force report filed by Captain Donnelly's precinct over the past years. Armed with a team of forensic data analysts and DOJ investigators, they began dismantling the culture of silence brick by brick. Captain Donnelly, seeing the catastrophic writing on the wall, attempted to submit his immediate resignation to secure his lucrative pension. Eleanor personally blocked it. Instead, Donnelly was publicly fired with cause for administrative negligence and complicity in the cover-up, stripping him of his retirement benefits and leaving him in financial ruin. Dozens of officers who had previously hidden behind the union's protective umbrella suddenly found their old buried complaints being resurrected and handed over to federal prosecutors. A wave of panic swept through the corrupt ranks of the state's law enforcement. Cops who had built their careers on bullying and unwarranted aggression were suddenly terrified of the citizens they swore to protect, realizing that any one of them could be another Eleanor Whitaker, a quiet, unassuming force capable of utterly destroying their lives. The digital age had fundamentally changed the battlefield. The monopoly on truth, once tightly held by official police press releases, had been permanently broken by the smartphone camera. Kai Owens, the college student who filmed the encounter, was hailed as a civic hero. He was interviewed on national television, sitting alongside S. Lee Merritt, calmly explaining that he only filmed the interaction because Bryce's body language was aggressively predatory from the very beginning. He hunted her, Kai told a primetime news anchor, his face grim. He picked out an elderly woman because he thought she would just take it. He thought she was helpless. He was just a bully who finally picked a fight with the wrong matriarch. Months after the incident, the federal courthouse was surrounded by a sea of news vans, barricades, and heavily armed U.S. Marshals. The air was thick with anticipation. Inside the grand mahogany-paneled courtroom, the silence was heavy and absolute. Bryce Langford stood before the judge's bench. He looked fundamentally different from the man who had strutted through the mall. He had lost weight. His posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded in permanent defeat. His hair was thinning and his eyes darted nervously around the room, entirely devoid of the cruel spark that had once defined him. He had taken the plea deal. The prospect of a lengthy sentence had broken him completely, forcing him to plead guilty to all federal charges, including the civil rights violations and the conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Richard Donnelly had taken a similar deal, currently awaiting his own transfer to a minimum security federal camp. Sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking as immaculate and unbothered as the day they met, was Eleanor Whitaker. She wore a deep navy blue suit, her silver hair perfectly pinned. She watched Bryce with cold, calculating eyes, holding no malice, but absolutely no pity. "Mr. Langford," the federal judge began, adjusting his reading glasses as he stared down at the disgraced officer. "In my years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more egregious, cowardly abuse of authority. You were entrusted with a badge, a firearm, and the profound responsibility to protect the public. Instead, you used that authority to terrorize an elderly citizen to satisfy your own fragile pride." Bryce kept his eyes glued to the floor, swallowing hard. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room, "your immediate instinct was not remorse, but deceit. You conspired to leverage the power of your institution to destroy an innocent woman's life to cover up your own violent cowardice. You are a disgrace to the uniform and a danger to a free society." The judge picked up his wooden gavel. "Bryce Langford, I sentence you to years in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from ever holding public office, possessing a firearm, or working in any capacity related to private or public security. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals." The gavel slammed down with a sharp, definitive crack. It sounded remarkably similar to the sound Bryce's hand had made against Eleanor's face. Bryce's knees visibly buckled. Two marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing his arms, careful to avoid his surgically repaired shoulder, and began escorting him toward the side door leading to the holding cells. As he was turned around, Bryce's hollow eyes met Eleanor's from across the room. He expected to see her smiling, gloating over his total destruction. Instead, she just looked at him with profound, icy indifference. To her, Bryce was not a conquered enemy. He was merely trash that had finally been taken out. He was a systemic error that she had successfully corrected. Bryce was led through the heavy wooden door, the lock clicking shut behind him, sealing away his freedom for years. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor Whitaker stood on the wide granite steps, flanked by S. Lee Merritt and several members of her oversight commission. The flashbulbs of the press corps illuminated the afternoon sky. Microphones were thrust toward her, reporters shouting over one another to get a quote from the woman who had single-handedly brought a corrupt police department to its knees. Eleanor held up a single black-gloved hand, and the roaring crowd fell instantly silent. "The badge is a symbol of public trust," Eleanor stated, her voice calm, resonant, and carrying clearly over the plaza. When that trust is weaponized to inflict violence upon the vulnerable, it is not merely a crime, it is a betrayal of the social contract. Mr. Langford has faced the consequences of his actions, but our work is not finished. She looked directly into the bank of television cameras. To the officers who serve with honor, you have our deepest gratitude. But to those who hide behind a uniform to exercise their own personal cruelty, understand that the shadows you operate in are gone. We are watching, we are recording, and we will not hesitate to dismantle you. Eleanor Whitaker turned and walked down the steps toward her waiting car, leaving a profoundly altered world in her wake. She had transformed a moment of terrifying victimization into a masterclass of systemic reform. Bryce Langford had swung his hand hoping to break a frail woman. Instead, he had struck solid iron, shattering himself and the corrupt foundation he stood upon into dust. True justice rarely arrives wrapped in perfect, cinematic bows. But when arrogance collides with absolute, unyielding capability, the resulting shockwave alters reality forever. The destruction of Bryce Langford was not merely a physical defeat on a cold mall floor. It was the total annihilation of a toxic mindset that equated a uniform with invincibility. Eleanor Whitaker did not just defend her own life. She weaponized her assailant's hubris against him, turning his violent impulse into the very mechanism that dismantled a deeply corrupt institution. Karma, in this profound instance, bypassed the slow gears of fate and delivered itself instantly, proving that power without discipline is always a fatal liability. The Iron Matriarch's legacy endures as a stark, terrifying warning to those who abuse authority. The vulnerable are not always weak, and true strength requires no badge to bring a bully to their knees.